Okay. Greetings, everyone. My name is Chandani Jaswal, and on behalf of Tarikh, the History Association of Meherchand Mahajan DAV College for Women, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome the eminent art and architectural historian, Dr. Marine Chida Razvi, who will be presenting a special lecture on the topic, The Memory and Symbolism in Mughal Tombs. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. A little introduction about our college. Meherchand Mahajan DAV College for Women is located in Chandigarh, which is 250 kilometers north of Delhi. The college was founded in 1968 to honor the memory of Justice Meherchand Mahajan, the first Chief Justice of India. We celebrated our Golden Jubilee in 2018, wherein the Honorable President of India, Shri Ram Nath Kovindji, also visited our institution. Our college is a postgraduate institution affiliated to the Punjab University in Chandigarh. The history students of the college have organized themselves into this association called Tarikh, which organizes lectures and activities from time to time. I would like to extend my gratitude here to our principal, Dr. Nisha Bhargav, for her guidance and for always encouraging us in all our academic pursuits. And now I invite the head of our department, Mrs. Poonam Devesha, to please introduce our eminent speaker to the audience. Poonam ma'am.
Hello, good evening, everyone. On behalf of principal, staff, and students of Department of History of MCMGV College, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Mehreen Chida Rizvi. Dr. Rizvi is an art historian with specialization in the Mughal period. Dr. Rizvi is the deputy curator in the Nasir Khilali collection of Islamic art and the in-house editor for their publication series. Her topic of discussion today, Memory and Symbolism in the Mughal Tomb, would introduce the students to a new dimension of Islamic and Indo-Islamic art. Dr. Rizvi, I'm sure our students would be delighted with your erudite expertise and knowledge in every way possible, as medieval Indian history is part of their curriculum. Ma'am, your deliberations would open up new avenues of knowledge and learning for our students. A very warm welcome to you and looking forward for an enriching session. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam ma'am. And before I hand it over to Dr. Chida Razvi for this much awaited lecture, a few cardinal rules for this lecture. You're requested, dear audience, to please ensure that your microphones and cameras are off for the duration of the lecture. You can put your questions in the chat box. We would be taking them up after ma'am has given her lecture, or you can raise your hands after the lecture is over to ask your question directly to Dr. Chida Razvi. And without further ado, I now hand it over to the eminent speaker, Dr. Chida Razvi. Ma'am.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, I would like to just say thank you very, very much to Dr. Bhargava, Mrs. Devasher, Chandini, and to the History Association for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here, and a very special thank you to Chandini for facilitating everything. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And once I do this, I don't think I'll be able to see everybody. So if I have any internet issues, please interrupt me, because occasionally I might, but hopefully that will not be the case. Okay, can everybody see the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to have so many of you in attendance. So today, I wanted to talk to you about imperial Mughal mausoleums, which are some of the most iconic examples of Mughal architecture. As an art and architectural historian, my approach to the study of buildings is based upon one fundamental question. What can these structures tell us about the society or culture that created them? The Mughals, the dynastic Muslim rulers of South Asia from 1526 to 1858, created incredible works of art, and funerary architecture in particular, that have continued to stand as some of the most iconic examples of this genre. So the structures that I wanted to discuss with you today, I want to kind of tease out from them what we're able to learn about the political and cultural context of their creation. Despite the dynasty ruling for a period of 332 years, it was the successive reigns of the 3rd to 5th Mughal emperors, Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, that saw the construction of the only 4 monumental imperial tombs to be built during the entire Mughal era. And by the term imperial, in relation to these mausoleums, I'm indicating that they are the location of an emperor's burial. This lecture will examine these 4 mausoleums and draw out certain aspects of their symbolic, temporal, and political importance. Specifically, I want to discuss how these tombs were used as symbols of power and political authority, how they represented dynastic importance and lineage, their commemorative aspect, not only for the buried, deceased ruler, but also for the tomb's patron. And I'll touch on how they represented the Quranic concept of paradise. These 4 imperial tombs were built sequentially during a period of only 81 years. The tomb of Humayun, the 2nd emperor, was built by his son and successor Akbar outside the city walls of Delhi. Akbar's mausoleum was built by his son and successor Jahangir in the city of Sikandra. Jahangir's tomb was built by his wife Nur Jahan outside the city of Lahore. And the last of these is the Taj Mahal outside of Agra, built by the 5th emperor Shah Jahan for his wife, but who was also buried there after his own death. While there were monumental Mughal tombs constructed after the Taj Mahal, none were made for an imperial burial. After Shah Jahan's reign, the Mughal emperors were buried either at Sufi shrine complexes or at the tomb of Humayun. The heritage of the Mughals is intertwined with the different layers of symbolism to be discussed in this talk, so it's important to understand the cultural context from which the dynasty emerged. And I'm sure much of this is known to you, so I'm going to keep it brief. The founder of the Mughal dynasty was Babur, a Timurid prince from the Ferghana Valley, located primarily in today's Uzbekistan. Babur was a descendant of the great Central Asian ruler Timur on his father's side and the fierce Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan on his mother's. He was a prince without a proper kingdom, however, and after establishing himself in Kabul, ultimately settled on South Asia as a potential area to conquer. At the time, the region of northern India was ruled by the Delhi Sultans, and in 1526, Babur defeated the reigning Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi, in a decisive victory at the Battle of Panipat. After doing so, Babur claimed the lands of the Delhi Sultan as his own, and he ushered in the Mughal era. Whereas the term Mughal is the Persian term for Mongol, the early Mughal rulers considered themselves to be Timurid, referencing the great empire established by their ancestor Timur, the incredible courtly culture of the Timurid court, and the Central Asian Turkic aspect of Timurid heritage. It was this Timurid heritage which was of utmost importance to Babur, rather than the nomadic, unrefined Mongolian one. From his father's side, Babur was a great-great-great-grandson of Timur, and he saw himself as the great conqueror's heir and the savior of the Timurid line. He instilled this way of thinking into his son Humayun, and the importance of this heritage passed to future generations as well. As they were initially conquering from outside South Asia, inheriting a society in which they were the religious minority, ruling over a non-Muslim majority population, it was imperative for the early Mughal rulers to create visual stamps of their authority, rulership, and religious supremacy within their empire. They accomplished this in multiple ways, but their funerary architecture, and specifically these 4 monuments, embodied such intent. These were monuments of commemoration, yes, but they were equally created as symbols of the Mughals' power and political authority and their dynastic importance. Before entering into a discussion of these mausoleums within the larger context of their individual production, both within the existing funerary architecture of South Asia and in relation to the Mughals' Timurid heritage, I want to briefly introduce the creation of each to you and their architectural forms and spaces. Despite the fact that these four structures present stark visual differences on first appearance and individual characteristics when we see them side by side, it will be shown that there are similarities and traits that they share, which unite them together as well. Completed in 1571, the first of the monumental Mughal tombs, Humayun's mausoleum in Delhi, was one of the first building campaigns his son Akbar embarked upon after coming to the throne, and certainly the first one done on such a vast scale. The tomb is situated in the middle of an enclosed charbagh garden, a Persianate garden type in which the garden is divided into four equal sections by water channels and walkways, and in some cases, such as here, subdivided further into equal parts. The tomb sits on a large elevated platform containing a series of vaulted chambers and cells, and within these cells can be found over 100 grave markers. From 1575 until about 1850, various Mughal princes, princesses, and emperors were buried at this site. It's been suggested that the many cells built into the tomb platform indicate that it was likely constructed as a dynastic burial site, and this would have been the patron's, so Akbar's, desire. But with the construction of his subsequent tomb by Jahangir, the idea of a single dynastic mausoleum was lost. And if a dynastic mausoleum was indeed Akbar's desire, this could have been due to the Mughals' Timurid heritage. For we know that Timur constructed a dynastic mausoleum in one of his capital cities, Kesh, where he had intended for himself to be buried. The tomb was designed by an architect of Central Asian and Afghan descent, Mirza Muhammad Miraq, who was working for Akbar. He was born in Bukhara, but his family was originally from Herat, one of the great Timurid capitals. And he had trained and worked in both cities before coming to South Asia. He was thus acquainted with the Timurid and Persianate building traditions of Bukhara and Herat and their surrounds. And on his arrival in Delhi, he was able to see the existing royal Muslim architecture constructed by the Delhi sultans. Thus, Mirza Muhammad Miraq was familiar with the buildings of the sultanates as well as Timurid constructions abroad, and he combined elements of the two styles in Humayun's tomb. Reminiscent of royal Delhi Sultanate architecture is the overall aesthetic of the monument in the combination of red sandstone with white marble accents, and the use of local architectural forms like chhatris and engaged colonnettes. However, the wider architectural vocabulary of the tomb, such as a slightly bulbous dome atop an elevated drum, the monumentality of the structure, the elevated portal entrances known as pishtaks, and the radially symmetrical nine-fold ground plan are of Central Asian or Timurid origin, as is the placement of the tomb in the center of the four-part garden. The ground floor contains a central two-story domed octagonal chamber surrounded by 8 other rooms, each interconnected by corridors. In this central chamber is a commemorative cenotaph for the Emperor Humayun, while his actual grave is in a crypt immediately below. The interconnected spaces on both the ground and first floors allow for ritual circumambulation of the central chamber to take place. The construction of Akbar's tomb was the first building campaign embarked upon by Jahangir on his accession to the throne as the 4th emperor in 1605. The mausoleum was constructed in Sikandra, outside Agra. Like Humayun's tomb, it's situated in the middle of an enclosed charbagh. The enclosure wall has 4 gateways built as part of it, but only the southern one is an actual entrance into the funerary garden. On this entrance gate were constructed 3-storied minars of white marble, and this was the first time multiple towers of this type were used in Mughal architecture. The form of Akbar's tomb is quite different from that of Humayun's. It consists of 5 tiered stories, the first 4 of which are faced with red sandstone, while the topmost one is covered in white marble. This final tier is essentially an open courtyard enclosed by pierced jali screens. The broad ground floor has chhatris built atop each corner, and in the center of each side is a pishtak, the elevated entrance portal which we've just seen at Humayun's tomb. Each pishtak is decorated with marble inlay and topped with another chhatri. And from the center of the ground story, the other 4 rise, each accentuated with arcades and chhatris as well. The commemorative cenotaph of Akbar was placed in the center of the topmost tier, while the sarcophagus covering Akbar's true grave was placed within the ground floor, and that's what you see here. A single corridor provides access to the gravesite, located in a square chamber set into the heart of the structure. This chamber has a vaulted ceiling that used to be decorated with frescoes, but was whitewashed in the latter half of the 17th century, while the sarcophagus itself is plain and without any inscriptions. This is in stark contrast to the cenotaph on the top tier of the mausoleum, which was extensively carved with inscriptions and exquisite floral motifs in low relief. An interesting description of some of the original interior decoration of the tomb chamber is relayed to us by the Italian scholar and writer Niccolò Manucci. Writing on Akbar's tomb sometime between 1658 and 1670, he states that there were human representations depicted with both the gateway and the tomb chamber on the walls, including, amongst other figures, the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ. According to Manucci, these were obliterated on the order of the 6th Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb Alamgir. Returning to the form of the mausoleum, it is one of a group of terraced tombs built during Jahangir's reign, albeit the most elaborate version of this type. And Jahangir's own mausoleum can be seen as a continuation of the terraced tomb type to which his fathers belonged. This style of tomb was constructed not only by Jahangir for members of his family, but also by his queen, Nur Jahan, in the tomb she built for her parents, the tomb of Itamad ad-Dawla in Agra that you see here. And then in this, the tomb she built for her husband between 1628 and 1638. And although I didn't include a picture, her own tomb in Lahore is all of the same type. Situated in the center of a walled-in charbagh garden, which is divided into 16 sections, Jahangir's mausoleum is a single-story structure faced in red sandstone with white marble decoration. It was constructed as a plinth with an arcaded veranda, which had many cells built into it. In the center of the plinth is the octagonal tomb chamber, containing the true sarcophagus of the emperor. The tomb chamber is entirely faced in marble, with architectural accents and designs picked out in black against white. The marble sarcophagus within the burial chamber is raised on a marble platform, decorated with pietra dura work of flowers inlaid in precious stones, including carnelian, lapis lazuli, amethyst, and turquoise. The series of chambers built into the external walls of the mausoleum and the 4 passageways leading to the central tomb chamber were fully decorated with fresco paintings of floral motifs, fruits, and vessels, including platters, wine cups, rosewater sprinklers, and vases, while the external dados and those of the passageways were decorated with mosaic tile decoration. When you stand atop the monument, the aesthetic is completely different than when you are looking at the mausoleum, as the red sandstone that dominates the facade is not visible. Marble pavements were used, and marble was used to face the small platform which sits on the center of the roof. And this was the original location of Jahangir's commemorative cenotaph, no longer in existence. In this way, there appears to be a resonance with Akbar's tomb, with the white marble roof space of Jahangir's mausoleum recalling the white marble top story of Akbar's tomb. A completely new architectural feature seen at Jahangir's mausoleum is the inclusion of the 5-story octagonal minars of multicolored marble. We saw the use of minars atop the gateway to Akbar's tomb garden, but here is the first time we have the inclusion of minars as an integral part of the architecture of a Mughal funerary monument itself. The last of the 4 monumental imperial tombs was not actually constructed to be the site of an emperor's burial. Shah Jahan constructed it in Agra for his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, after her death in 1631. But when he himself passed away in 1666, he was buried there by Alamgir. There was not actually an imperial mausoleum that was custom built for him. As with the other 3, the Taj Mahal is situated within a funerary garden. However, it was not placed at the center like the others, but at one end overlooking the Yamuna. And you can see that orientation in the Google Earth image to the left on the screen. There are many similarities between the formal aspects of the Taj Mahal's architecture and that of Humayun's mausoleum. Both mausoleum plans are chamfered squares or irregular octagons. Both employ the radially symmetrical 9-fold plan of Timurid origin. Both are 2-story mausoleums with a central octagonal chamber. Both employ pishtaks at the center of each of their facades. Both have a bulbous double-shell dome elevated upon a tall drum. Both employ chhatris to enhance the exterior profile of the monument, and both have colonnettes starting at the base of the mausoleum, rising until they are above the silhouette. However, every aspect of the Taj Mahal is a more refined, perfect form than that seen at Humayun's tomb. Rising from the square plinth upon which the mausoleum sits are round, slightly tapering minars crowned by chhatris. While we saw the use of minars as part of the architecture of Jahangir's mausoleum, their inclusion at the Taj Mahal is more as a framing device for the actual mausoleum itself. The central octagonal tomb chamber, containing the cenotaphs of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, is a double-storied domed space, around which is an ambulatory. These marble cenotaphs are raised on marble plinths, the whole ensemble ornamented with floral pietra dura. Directly beneath this octagonal tomb chamber is the crypt, in which the true sarcophagi of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal were placed, and these were also marble inlaid with pietra dura. So having now introduced these 4 sites to you, and taking notes of the similarities and differences between them, I want to return to the ideas of symbolism and memory, and the ways in which certain aspects of these were exemplified through the built structures and their functional spaces. And the first of these I want to talk about is the symbolic visualization of power, and specifically political power, exemplified by the construction of Humayun's tomb in the surrounds of the city of Delhi. So remember, Delhi was the seat of Muslim political power in the region during the reign of the Delhi Sultans from 1206 to 1526. From the start of this period, the rulers of Delhi and their families built royal monumental tombs, and they were the ones who introduced this type of architecture to the region. As their capital cities were located in and around Delhi, the sultans frequently built their own royal tombs in these surrounding areas, to such an extent that we can effectively say they created a royal necropolis. So when Babur conquered the last Delhi Sultan, he inherited a region in which a 300-year-old tradition of royal Muslim funerary architecture already existed. And I've just put a few examples on the screen for you. So the earliest surviving monumental built tomb of Iltutmish, the tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, and then the later tombs of Mubarak Shah Sayyid and Sikandar Lodi. So just imagine, therefore, the political symbolism of Akbar constructing his father's tomb in this same area. The successive Muslim rulers of the Delhi Sultanates, buried in the environs of their capital city, their tombs now dwarfed in comparison to this, the first monumental Mughal mausoleum. through the incorporation at Humayun's tomb of local materials and local architectural forms, and a very recognizable local aesthetic that characterized the architecture of the Delhi Sultanates and its placement within the wider context of the Sultanate necropolis of Delhi. A clear statement was architecturally created that indicated the continuity of Muslim rule by the Mughals. But at the same time, and even more strongly represented by this massive structure and the funerary space, was the fact that this was a representation of superiority, of imperial power and lineage. And that is what this mausoleum was representing. Dwarfing the tombs of the sultanates in scale, created within a complex that was vast, Humayun's mausoleum was the largest funerary structure created in South Asia when it was completed. And we can say that Akbar used this construction to indicate that the Mughals were the superlative Islamic power in the region, and the now established political power as well, supplanting the rulers who came before them, both literally and through the creation of this mausoleum, figuratively. In addition to this proclamation of power in relation to the sultans of Delhi, Akbar's construction of Humayun's mausoleum also had an incredibly important resonance in relation to that of the Muslim ruler Sher Shah. As I'm sure you know, Humayun's reign was actually very turbulent, and for a period of 15 years was disrupted due to Sher Shah. Once he had succeeded to the Mughal throne, Humayun's most potent adversary was Sher Khan, an Afghan noble who had served as Babur's governor of Bihar. In 1539, after being soundly defeated by Sher Khan's army, Humayun fled west, ultimately seeking refuge at the Safavid court of Iran, where he requested military aid to take back his kingdom. After defeating Humayun, Sher Khan proclaimed himself Sultan and ruled what had been Humayun's kingdom under the title of Sher Shah. After his death, he was followed by his son, who reigned until he was overthrown by Humayun in 1555, who, with the military aid of the Safavid Shah, was able to return to South Asia and reclaim his birthright. During his time in power, Sher Shah built his own mausoleum in Bihar, which was, when it was constructed, the largest Muslim tomb in South Asia. And I didn't put them in because I was worried about time, but Sher Shah also constructed a tomb for his father and a tomb for his grandfather. And he made these tombs to be, he built them as a way of creating a very politically potent backstory for himself, because they were built in the style of, tombs of nobles, and his grandfather had been a horse trader, so he came from quite humble stock. But he uses this power of architecture that I'm discussing when he creates, this tomb for his father, this tomb for his grandfather, to build up his lineage, which then gives him the right, I suppose you could say, to build a tomb like this for himself. So the form that this structure took was a continuation of the domed, arcaded octagonal tombs built by the final Delhi Sultanate dynasties, the Sayyids and the Lodhis. However, Sher Shah's was constructed on a much, much larger scale. It was multi-storied, and it was set in the middle of a man-made water tank within a large walled-in enclosure. Because it was Sher Shah who had been responsible for chasing Humayun out of South Asia and taking the lands of the Mughals, when Akbar commissioned Humayun's tomb, he certainly intended to build a mausoleum which surpassed Sher Shah's in scale and importance of location. Furthermore, through the formal aspects of the architecture that tied Humayun's tomb to the Timurid Central Asian heritage of the Mughals, Akbar commissioned a structure in which the political power and imperial nature of the Mughals as the successors of the Timurids was projected. This was in contrast to the idea projected by Sher Shah's tomb, which was visually and politically linked to the architecture of the Delhi Sultans. This idea of projecting dynastic memory and lineage through their patronage of funerary architecture became a characteristic of imperial Mughal tombs, both in the representation of their Timurid heritage, but also in portraying their own immediate Mughal dynastic line. The early example of Humayun's tomb made direct references to the Timurid past of the Mughals in what we can consider to be a purposeful manner through the use of the architectural features I've already detailed. We can say that there was a need to project this heritage of power and rule when Akbar commissioned his father's mausoleum, as the recent history of the Mughals at that point had not been one that was particularly successful. Remember, Humayun had only just taken back his kingdom in 1555, after 15 years of being in exile, and a year after that he died in an accidental fall. And yet, for such an ineffectual ruler, this incredibly grand imperial commemorative monument was created. And we see, therefore, Akbar's understanding of how buildings, and in this case his father's tomb, could be used to create a vision of a more glorious past, beyond the commemoration of a single individual, drawing on and representing a lineage resplendent with power and prestige. Ultimately, we have in Akbar the first true imperial ruler of a Mughal empire. And at the end of his 49-year reign, he handed to his son Jahangir an established, politically powerful, wealthy, stable empire. So when we see Akbar's tomb, we shouldn't view it as being, this idea of being a monument to Timurid heritage that I discussed in relation to Humayun's. We don't see that so much in Akbar's. Instead, we're seeing a monument which speaks to Mughal political power and rule and their own immediate lineage. We know the extent to which Jahangir involved himself in the production of his father's mausoleum through his autobiographical memoirs. And so the final form of Akbar's tomb is what Jahangir himself intended it to be. And he writes, "On Monday the 17th, I set out on foot to visit the blessed tomb of His Majesty Arshashani. When I attained the felicity of a visitation and saw the building over the blessed tomb, it didn't look the way I wanted it to, because I had intended it to be such that world travelers wouldn't be able to point to another such building in all the world. Since during construction, the ill-omened Khusro had to be dealt with, and I had to go to Lahore, the builders had constructed it according to their own tastes. In the end, some modifications were made, and although a huge amount has been spent on it, and they worked on it for 3 or 4 years, I ordered expert architects to redesign certain places, this time in consultation with men of knowledge, in such a way that it would be acceptable." And I thought I would also just share with you this lovely painting in which we have in the background Akbar's mausoleum. So in this passage, Jahangir is telling us that after seeing the form of the tomb, the form that the tomb had taken while he'd been away on a military campaign, he was displeased as the architects had created something of their own design. And as a result, he ordered the parts which offended him to be torn down. And he, along with his architect, determined the new form of the tomb. Looking at the multiple terraces of Akbar's tomb, stacked upon each other, and the prolific use of chhatris and the incorporation of the trabeate system of architecture on this burial monument, I think it's possible to claim that there is a visual link between the architecture of Akbar's tomb and that of his capital city of Fatehpur Sikri, a site associated with political power and imperial authority. Perhaps it was this symbolic resonance that Jahangir intended to present at his father's tomb by the use of architecture and spatial composition that recalled the royal residential pavilions of Fatehpur Sikri. And by creating this association, the political power of Akbar and the Mughal dynasty was meant to be represented at this site. And I think in truth, we are seeing at Akbar's mausoleum a site which is less concerned with representing a Timurid heritage and one more focused on representing a now established Mughal lineage and portraying Mughal imperial memory. And this is also true of Jahangir's mausoleum, where the architecture and decoration of the funerary monument is very clearly created in a style associated with Jahangir's reign, but even more so with both his own royal architectural patronage and that of his queen, Nur Jahan. It is this personal association which explains some of the idiosyncratic features of the mausoleum, which are unique to the site. Jahangir's mausoleum is the simplest of the 4 monumental imperial tombs in its architecture and in certain aspects of its decoration as well. Despite this, however, there are unique elements of the site which can be said to have been included as a way in which to bring distinction to it. And the inclusion of the Banars is one such example, as is the incredible decorative program, which is much more detailed than that seen at either Humayun's or Akbar's mausoleums. The most unique feature of the site, however, was the inclusion of animate imagery within the decoration. And you see here some examples of that. So the duck heads, the parrot heads, the elephant heads on vessels, and then that very funny looking fish just there. The use of animate imagery was a hallmark of Jahangir's imperial architecture and of Nur Jahan's patronage as well. And the inclusion of such decoration at Jahangir's mausoleum automatically relates the site to his reign and to the royal couple's patronage. Moving now to the Taj Mahal, we have an interesting case as it returns in part to the ideals of heritage and lineage that were presented at Humayun's tomb. As noted, the Taj Mahal is essentially a refined, perfected version of Humayun's mausoleum. And as this was so blatant, it's clear that the Timurid residence present at Humayun's tomb was purposely recalled in the construction of the Taj Mahal. This was because, in addition to the mausoleum being a funerary monument in honor of his wife, the tomb and associated complex were clearly constructed as a monument to the glory of Shah Jahan's reign. And this glorification was accomplished in part through the reemergence and perfection of Timurid ideals of architecture at the site. And this was because, remember, their Timurid heritage played a large part in the imperial ideology of the Mughals, and this was especially true of Shah Jahan. Explicit links between Timur, the Timurid royal line, and the Mughal rulers were created in not only the artistic output of the Mughal court from Babur's reign onward, but also in court histories and the written word. Shah Jahan, however, was the ruler to make the most direct, explicit links between himself and Timur. And this is exemplified by the 2 examples I'm going to share here. One being this opening double-page portrait in the Windsor Padshahnameh, which shows Timur passing his crown directly to Shah Jahan, and in doing so, symbolically proclaiming Shah Jahan as his true heir, bypassing all the rulers who came in between them. And the direct link between the 2 was also accomplished via other means. For example, through one of the regnal titles taken by Shah Jahan, Second Lord of the Auspicious Conjunction. And this is referencing a particular astronomical configuration deemed to be especially auspicious. And this title linked him directly to Timur, one of his titles was Lord of the Auspicious Conjunction. The emphasis that Shah Jahan placed on relating himself to Timur can then be linked to the intentional copying of Humayun's mausoleum in the creation of the Taj Mahal, and the resultant recreation of a monument that, in its architectural forms, plan, and formal qualities, recalls the Timurid heritage of the Mughals and of Shah Jahan in particular. This emphasis on portraying Mughal lineage and dynastic importance at or through funerary monuments was present during this period of the Mughal era in other ways as well. For example, the tomb of the dynasty's founder, Babur, in Kabul, was the recipient of several enhancements and additions by his successors. Jahangir created a blatant visual linkage between Babur and Timur in 1607 when he ordered a tombstone to be erected at Babur's grave, inscribed with Babur's lineage traced back to his Central Asian ancestor. And you can see that tombstone in the picture on the right. Shah Jahan, in turn, a small marble mosque on the terrace immediately below Babur's tomb. And that you see on the left, the white marble structure sitting just below the sandstone facade of the upper terrace. This physical patronage at the funerary site of the dynasty's founder was a way for these two Mughal emperors, for example, to create visual symbols of their dynastic lineage. And this was true also of their desire to be associated with Timur and his funerary site, the Gur-e Amir. This was the tomb Timur built for his heir, who passed away before him. He built this in Samarkand, and it ended up being where Timur himself was later buried. And both Jahangir and Shah Jahan sent funds to the Gur-e Amir for its upkeep, linking themselves through the direct patronage of Timur's mausoleum complex with Timur himself. The concept of associating an individual with a site, and conversely, a site with an individual, raises the third theme of this talk, that of funerary monuments as commemorative structures. It goes without saying that a funerary monument is a commemorative monument to the individual who is buried there. It's a way of honoring them, of creating an architectural space which visually stands as a monument to the memory of the deceased. Within the funerary context of the Mughals, the idea of commemoration was enhanced in a particular way that differentiated these imperial tombs from those elsewhere in the Muslim world, both geographically and temporally. It must not have escaped you that in relation to the patronage of these four sites, the first three were not built by the emperor who was buried there, but in the case of Humayun's and Akbar's, they were built by their respective sons and successors. And in the case of Jahangir's, it was built by his wife. The Taj Mahal was indeed built by Shah Jahan, but he never conceived of it as a site where he would ultimately be buried. It was planned and executed to be a funerary monument solely to his wife, Mumtaz Mahal. This contrasts these monumental tombs with the tradition of royal funerary architecture often seen in South Asia, as well as elsewhere in the Muslim world, where usually it was the case that a monarch would build a tomb for himself during his own lifetime, or at least start such a construction. Because the pattern of patronage, which we see in the creation of these four Mughal sites, because of the pattern of patronage, which we see in the creation of these four Mughal sites, not only were these monuments conceived as spaces to commemorate the deceased, but they became standing symbols of the power of the patron as well. And it's this aspect of commemoration that I want to bring attention to. Within the Mughal tradition, it was the name of the patron that was remembered in association with a structure. Architecture was viewed as a means of self-representation by the Mughal rulers and the royal family. And the patrons would be quite involved in the actual planning and decoration of the sites. Indeed, in the case of Shah Jahan, we can actually consider him to be one of the architects of the building commissions. How involved was he as an architectural patron? Architecture was his artistic medium par excellence, and he was a very hands-on patron. His official court histories record that he met daily with his court architects to discuss, alter, and approve plans, and that he considered his architectural commission as a means of perpetuating his legacy and being remembered throughout the annals of history. This is clearly stated, albeit in very flowery language, in the Padshah-Nameh of Abdul Hamid Lahori, which is the official history of Shah Jahan's reign, as I'm sure you know. Lahori writes, "The mind of the emperor, brilliant as the sun, paid great attention to lofty edifices and strong buildings, which, as the saying has it, verily our monuments will tell of. Long speak with mute eloquence of their master's high aspiration and sublime authority, and for ages to come are memorials of his love of land development, spreading of ornamentation, and nourishing of purity." which is a very over-the-top way of saying that the buildings will stand as monuments to Shah Jahan. And this was very much the case also for Jahangir's queen, Nur Jahan. She was an avid architectural patron and viewed her commissions as a means to establishing a perpetual legacy. That this was widely recognized, even at the time, we can infer from the writings of the Dutch East India Company merchant Francisco Pelsaer, who wrote of Nur Jahan that she erects very expensive buildings in all directions, sarais, or halting places for travelers and merchants, and pleasure gardens and palaces, such as no one has ever made before, intending thereby to establish an enduring reputation. Now, keeping in mind the idea that these monuments were built in part to commemorate the patron, as well as the deceased ruler, remember that I've named Nur Jahan as the patron of Jahangir's mausoleum. And it's this patronage which I want to use to exemplify the importance of the association of the patron with these imperial burial sites. My contention that Nur Jahan built her husband's tomb is based upon the formal architecture, style, and decoration of the mausoleum, as well as the historical and political circumstances of its production. However, this is in contrast to the contemporary historical documentation of the period in the form of Shah Jahan's official court histories, all of which name him as the patron. This juxtaposition very clearly shows us the power of architectural symbolism in relation to these monuments. Nur Jahan patronized Jahangir's mausoleum to not only commemorate her husband with an architectural commission that was stylistically and decoratively in line with the architecture that he constructed, but which was also clearly a part of the architectural oeuvre she had created while queen. As such, it was supposed to stand as a monument reflective of her patronage, remembering her to the visitor in addition to Jahangir. However, when the building was complete, Nur Jahan was literally written out of its history when Shah Jahan took credit for the structure within his histories, therefore becoming associated with the site as the patron. So this meant that historically, the mausoleum of Jahangir has been associated with the deceased emperor, but also recognized as being a site that commemorates the rule of his son and successor, Shah Jahan. It's the Taj Mahal, however, which is renowned as the architectural commission most famously associated with Shah Jahan's patronage, and it is without doubt the most famous Mughal funerary monument. The importance of the site in relation to the commemoration of Shah Jahan's reign is clear within his court histories, where it's emphatically stated that the site was intended to be a monument to his rule, while at the same time being constructed to the memory of his wife. It was the perfection of the Taj Mahal and its complex that was considered to be emblematic of the perfection of Shah Jahan as the imperial ruler. In fact, perfection of form, decoration, and planning was a hallmark of his architectural commissions, which were, remember, meant to stand as monuments to his reign and legacy. Moving now to the final theme I want to discuss with you this evening, that of paradisical symbolism. This takes several forms depending on which of the four funerary sites we're looking at, but I'll start with the one aspect that they all share, which is the placement of the tomb within a formal garden setting. In the Quran, paradise is described as an allegorical garden in which the believer will ever after dwell, consisting of lush gardens with trees, flowers, springs, fruits to consume, and carpets to recline on. In addition, cups of wine mixed with camphor to drink are given to those within the gardens, and passed amongst them will be round silver vessels and crystal goblets. The Quran also speaks of beautiful buildings in heaven, under which rivers flow, and of the four rivers of heaven, one each of milk, honey, wine, and water. This symbolic imagery provided a starting point for Muslim artists to visually represent paradise. And in the Mughal era, the royal architects and artists reinterpreted these passages in amazing ways. The intertwining of the garden and the tomb by the Mughals was not seen to such an extent anywhere else in the Islamic world, and the emperors took this combination to new heights both architecturally as well as symbolically. This association of Mughal funerary gardens and monuments with paradise was explicitly played upon as well as being alluded to. This is seen, for example, in the naming of Akbar's tomb garden as Behishtabad, meaning the abode of paradise, and in the placement of an inscription on the single entrance gate into his tomb garden, which reads, "These are the gardens of Eden, entered them to dwell therein eternally." So we're told at this site, via the garden name and by the inscription on the entrance into the funerary garden, that we're actually meant to be symbolically entering the gardens of paradise. We see then that the Mughal tomb garden was purposefully explicitly conceptualized as an earthly version of the gardens of paradise. And it was at the Taj Mahal that the most perfect realization of the funerary monument and complex as paradise was created. From contemporary historical and poetic texts, it is known that the Taj Mahal was intended to represent an earthly replica of Mumtaz Mahal's paradisical house in heaven. It has been convincingly argued by the Mughal art and architectural historian Ebba Koch that this explains the placement of the tomb at the end of its funerary garden, rather than in the traditional central placement that we've seen at the other three sites. In the case of the Taj Mahal, which was shifted to the end of the garden, adjacent to the riverfront, this was the result of the contemporary layout for the prevalent type of residential gardens in Agra in the 17th century. This placement therefore linked to the concept of residential garden space on earth with Mumtaz Mahal's residence in heaven. The fact that the monument was conceived as an earthly representation of a heavenly abode meant that the funerary garden of the Taj Mahal was already equated with paradise. But this was, however, further overtly expressed in several other ways, particularly through the inscriptions on the entrance gateway into the garden and in the profuse use of floral decoration on both the interior and exterior of the monuments. Looking first at the two-story gateway, which leads from the forecourt Taj Mahal complex into the tomb garden. The south facade, which is the one facing the visitor as they enter into the garden, is decorated with calligraphic verses from the Quran, including those from the chapter entitled Daybreak. That chapter invites the faithful to enter paradise. And so the inclusion of this particular verse creates an explicit association between the tomb garden and the gardens of paradise, where the departed will rest for eternity. It's also been argued that the use of naturalistic floral images in the Taj Mahal and throughout the funerary complex is indicative of the flowers of paradise. Their use, for example, on the exterior and interior dados of the mausoleum, where they are created as naturalistic, realistic floral bursts, serve to enhance the notion of an actual garden being represented within and on the monument, which itself was supposed to be, remember, an earthly representation of Mumtaz Mahal's heavenly residence. So it's been my aim this evening to introduce and contextualize the production of the only 4 monumental imperial tombs to have been created during the era of Mughal rule in South Asia, and to discuss the important role that they played in projecting symbolic associations of power and authority, dynasty, lineage, and memory, as well as invoking the Quranic concept of paradise. In relation to the established tradition of royal Muslim tombs within South Asia, the political implications of the tombs of the Delhi Sultans was not lost on the Mughals, who also made use of the political power of architecture in their own funerary constructions. Their aim in doing this was twofold: to continue to profess the might of Islam in the region, and to proclaim themselves as the supreme Muslim rulers in South Asia, firmly replacing the Delhi Sultans. We've also seen how the Timurid heritage of Mughals, which they placed an incredible amount of importance on, informed their architecture. The inherent character of Mughal architecture, and in particular their funerary structures, would not be what it is if not for the early desire to reference this aspect of their lineage. They were thus able to portray, through formal elements of their buildings, the propagation of rulership and imperial power that they wished to embody. However, the emphasis placed on the immediate Mughal dynastic line and on the creation of funerary spaces which reference the particular ruler who was buried there emerged once the Mughal Empire had been properly established. And it's the memory of the Mughal dynasty which became evident in those constructions. This ties into the concept of commemoration, which is inherent in funerary architecture. But as noted, the commemorative aspect seen at Mughal monuments had a dual purpose. Both the deceased and the patron were honored by the construction of these tombs, which stood as an architectural legacy to each individual. And finally, we've seen the direct relationship that was created between the Mughal funerary gardens and the Gardens of Paradise, and how in the case of the Taj Mahal, the monument itself was meant to be representative of Mumtaz Mahal's heavenly abode. As such, the entire Taj Mahal complex can truly be viewed as the creation of paradise on earth. So I thank you very much for your time, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. And if for some reason, you don't come up with questions today, but later on at a different time, please feel free to contact me either through my email or on social media. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chida Razvi, for this very, very insightful talk and a very enlightening lecture. I think for these 45 minutes, all of us were transported to the medieval era and thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. And I'm sure students have a lot of questions. But before we get to the Q&A session, I'd request everybody to please switch on their cameras for a group photograph. I'll give you 2 minutes. Oh, thank you. I'll take one now. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. And just an announcement, we've also floated the feedback form in the messages, so you can access it there. And like I stated before, you can put your questions in the chat box and I can take those up from there. Or you can directly ask Dr. Chida Razvi your question by raising your hand and we would recognize you. All right. Now maybe I'll be a little selfish here and begin by asking a question of my own, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you, ma'am. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself. So I can see a few hands. So quickly ask my question, ma'am. And I was thinking, ma'am, one of the questions that I had that you already answered is that how involved were the emperors in the making of the architecture, or was it solely the architect who was involved in all the motifs that you see? Was it the patrons doing, or was it the architects doing those intricate motifs, the flowers, the peacocks on the tombs?
I think it's fair to say that the patrons had their opinions, and they were able to say what they wanted and what they desired in terms of the the specificities of which flowers or what particular design or decoration was used. I think that was left more to the architect and to the craftsman to to design, and then the design would have been approved by the emperor or the queen or whoever was patronizing the specific monument.
So, ma'am, was there any instance of there being a rift between the architect and the patron over minutest of details that we see on the grave?
That's a really interesting question. Nothing that I've come across, because primarily our sources, our contemporary sources for this, it's either going to be the official court histories, whether they're written by courtiers or the autobiographies. Or in this period, we have quite a lot written by European visitors to the courts. And in both of those examples, in both of those bodies of writing, there's a bit of a skewed angle So in the official court histories, everything is written to, build up the ruler, to impress upon the reader their kingship, their perfection, that kind of thing. So like they wouldn't admit to having spats with the craftsmen and the like. And then from the European point of view, and those sources, they never really, the ones that I have read, they never really touch upon the craftsmen. They tend to be, for the most part, a kind of anonymous body of people.
Thank you, ma'am. And I can see that Akriti Thakur has raised her hand. So Akriti, you can ask your question to ma'am now.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Akriti Thakur. So my question is, like rulers starting from Delhi Sultanate to Mughals, most of them ordered to build their tomb after where they will be buried or commemorate after their death. So can we say that they believe in afterlife?
Interesting. Well, so the Delhi Sultans actually, for the most part, the Delhi Sultans build their own tombs during their life. So it's quite interesting that it's when we move into the Mughal period that we have the construction of these mausoleums once the emperor is gone. But I think certainly they did believe in paradise, in an afterlife, and that there would be something waiting them on the other side.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Akriti. I'm going to take a question from the chat box here. Mahalakshmi is asked. Mahalakshmi is, first of all, thank you for the lecture, and she says, can we say that Mughal architecture also had European influence? For example, a baluster-shaped column of the Shah Jahani period.
Yes, definitely. So I suppose the best example I can give of that is, yes, the baluster column, which is the one which has like a bulbous base and then tapers as it rises, which you see very frequently in Shah Jahani architecture. And Ebba Koch, who I mentioned in the talk, she's the premier Mughal architectural historian. She has written on this, actually, on the introduction of the baluster column into the Mughal architectural vocabulary, and traces its arrival through European engravings and book sources, actually. So that form coming into the Mughal period through them. So you do have examples of specific architectural forms like that, which, well, I guess that's probably the main one. So that is a European architectural form coming into Mughal architecture. And then the other element which you can say, I don't know if I would say that it has a European source per se, but the floral imagery, which becomes ubiquitous, not only in Mughal architecture, but in Mughal material culture across the board, that very natural representation, the very realistic representation of flowers and botanical imagery, that is the result of Mughal artists copying European scientific herbals and botanical manuals, and so teaching themselves how to create a very naturalistic, realistic representation of the flowers and of the plants. And so that, as I said, becomes ubiquitous in Mughal material culture. So you can say there is a European source, I suppose, for that as well.
Thank you, ma'am, and I hope Mahalakshmi got the answer. Samriddhi has raised her hand to ask a question. Samriddhi, you may ask your question, and please switch on your camera if possible.
Good evening, ma'am. So, first of all, your lecture was great. It was brief yet so descriptive.
Thank you.
You mentioned how they wanted to show how proud they were of their lineage and how they depicted that in all of their monuments. But somehow I feel that since they were building these monuments on Indian soil and they were using the Indians were actually the ones who were building them. So shouldn't these monuments also reflect some of the Indian styles?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were finished yet. Yes. So, no, it's a really good question. So initially, when we say the craftsmen were Indian, that is true. But by that point, and I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly. Please tell me if I'm not. So by the time the Mughals come into power, as I said, we've had 300 years of Delhi Sultanate rule. And so you have architects and craftsmen who are working for the Mughals, who are both local in that they are from the region, but they will be of any any religious background, any kind of cultural background, but you do also have people from outside coming in. And so that's why, so for example, looking at Humayun's tomb, that's why we can say very clearly that the conception behind that structure is coming from a Central Asian Timurid source, because the architect we know was from that region. And we also see this, it's a new way of building that bursts onto the scene, which has not been seen in the South Asian region before, because even the architecture of the Delhi Sultans, they were drawing on, they drew on local aspects of architecture, local forms, which gets incorporated into the architecture of the Sultans and gets transferred into the architecture of the Mughals. But they also looked to their heritage. So, some of the Delhi Sultanates, they came, they had their roots in Afghanistan, they had their roots further into Iran as well. So it's this entire region is an area where there's a lot of melding going on of different forms and different sources of inspiration. And when we talk about the fact that these are sites built within, South Asia, and so aren't they representing South Asia? Absolutely. I mean, they are very clearly of the region and representing the region. But there is this, wider political and cultural context, which brings in sources and influences from outside the region. And it's why we have this, incredibly particular way of thinking about building and thinking about, spaces, which we see in the architecture of the Mughals, and not just in the funerary architecture, but beyond that as well. I hope I answered your question and I didn't go off on a tangent.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have Venus Thakur who has a question. Venus, you may ask your question to ma'am.
First of all, thank you, ma'am. It was a very informative session. And my question is that, as you also mentioned about the walls being whitewashed during Alamgir's time, the walls of the chamber of Akbar's mausoleum. So how significantly does that hamper our interpretation of certain aspects of society? Because that's a valuable piece of history that's lost. And also, like, since you're a researcher and a historian, So how do we get see that in the brighter light and get over it with the with as in how do we present it, and that's a dead end, so where do we go from there and begin it and collate resources?
It's yeah, it's a very good question, and it is it is obviously problematic when you have um, spaces that have been transformed for whatever reasons, which removes them from their original state. Thankfully, we have the description, like the written record of this. So Manucci's description of the paintings he sees in Akbar's tomb, it's quite detailed. And so we know that he talks about seeing in the gateway representations of the Virgin, of the Christ child, of Saint Ignatius, who's a Jesuit priest, and some other Christian figures, and then again in the tomb chamber. So we have that written record, and then it's being able to extrapolate from that potentially how the space might have looked, and we can do that by comparing surviving structures with contemporary decoration which still exists. So I mentioned in relation to and then also just seeing the wider context of it all. So I mentioned in relation to Jahangir's mausoleum that inclusion of animate imagery, so that animal imagery in his mausoleum, and I said it was part of his architectural decorative device, and his queen Noor Jahan's as well. And we have and Akbar's tomb was built by Jahangir, so it fits that we have this type of imagery in his mausoleum. I have I've written a chapter actually on images of the Virgin Mary in Jahangir's architecture, and this description of Akbar's tomb features in that as one of the examples. So when you know that a site has been tampered with, it's just about trying to figure out how badly it's been tampered with, how accurate and truthful the source that you're seeing, which indicates what was there, how accurate and truthful that is, and then seeing if it fits together with surviving material that you can compare it to make sure that it's not fanciful, because this is one of the issues when looking at the European sources on the Mughal period. You do get fanciful descriptions at times. You do get things which you have to read very carefully to see if there's a bias, which is informing what is being written about as well. And with the Jahangir period, which is what I primarily focus on, you get corroboration in multiple texts, and they do fit with what survives. So in this particular example with Akbar's tomb, I think it's safe to say that these were properly there, and unfortunately were lost quite soon after it was built.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Venus. We have a question from Arshpreet, and she says, I wanted to ask, why were the tombs of the Delhi Sultanate rulers like the Sayyids or the Lodhis not as grand and magnificent as those of Mughal rulers?
So I agree, but we have to recognize that when they were built, they were the grandest, right? So what came before the Sayyids and what came before the Lodhis? And those tombs are constructed. So have to remember this correctly. I believe the Sayyids and the Lodhis were of Afghani origin. And in the creation of their royal tombs, they're drawing on a pre-existing Afghani tradition of royal tombs primarily being octagonal spaces and octagonal buildings. And tombs of nobles were either square or rectangular. So there was a differentiation in form for royal burials as opposed to elite burials. And prior to, the example I gave you of Muhammad Shah Sayyid's tomb, prior to that, the royal tombs which had been constructed were, you'd had, Iltutmish's, which had been a domed square space. You'd had Ghiasuddin Tughlaq's, which was again, quite a plain structure. But we have to recognize that the introduction of the monumental built tomb was a new architectural form in the region. And it gets more elaborate as time progresses. So when the Sayyids and the Lodhis are building their tombs, they are the most elaborate at that time. And then they get one-upped by Sher Shah, who takes that form, the octagonal domed tomb, and he amplifies it. He makes it bigger, he makes it grander, he places it within a water tank, giving it paradisical connotations as well. And then when we shift into the Mughal period, we have this new introduction of the Timurid concept of building. And that's really what transforms these types of structures to make them as grand as they are. Because one of the core concepts behind Timurid construction was a focus on monumentality and creating large spaces and creating symmetrical spaces, and not just individual buildings, but complexes as well. So the whole, it's a brand new way of thinking about architecture in a space that can be created, which we see with Humayun's tomb. And then, you have the example, you have what you have to match, what you have to better as you move forward in time. So it's just about seeing the progression of this at various points in time.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Khatri is the HOD of our sister college, DAV Sector 10, and sir's asked a question in the chat box. He's thanked you for the very interesting and informative talk on Mughal architecture, and he says that as you mentioned that the Mughal architecture absorbed the local, especially the Rajput style, do you think that the Mughal style influenced regional styles and art representation in peripheral areas of the Mughal kingdom?
Yes, absolutely. So, gosh, that's actually an entire lecture in and of itself. But it is safe to say that yes, absolutely, that did happen. With, I mentioned that with Akbar, we have the first, we have in him the first proper emperor. He's the one to really create what we call a proper empire. And in order to do that, for that to be successful, we have the incorporation into the courtly elite of the Rajput nobility, of the local nobility into the Mughal court. And so when that happens, there's so much, what's the best way to put it? There's so much communal sharing, which is happening at that time. And it happens earlier as well, but during Akbar's is where we really see that, because don't forget, he's also the first Mughal ruler to marry outside of the Timurid bloodline. He marries into the Rajput nobility. So you have Jahangir as the first Mughal ruler to not be purely Timurid anymore, but to now be, we can say of the soil, because he's half Rajput and half Timurid. And sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but that's just to illustrate how cohesive the Mughal court was in terms of not being this isolated, Timurid entity in South Asia. And when we talk about Mughal architecture in particular, but this does extend to other forms of material culture and courtly practice as well, you absolutely see a impact from imperial Mughal architecture into not only in the capital cities, but throughout the empire. We can say that that Mughal architecture has an imperial nature, which is to say that you see new forms, new expressions, new types of buildings, new architectural decoration happening at that very elite level of imperial patronage and royal patronage. And from there it filters down, because it gets copied as a means of projecting, political power, tying oneself to political power. It gets copied then by the court elites, by local governors, by the people who are governing in the subas and the provinces, as you filter down, the months of their system in the empire. So yeah, absolutely. And one of the idea, or sorry, the example jumping into my head at the moment is, I'm going to embarrass myself because I can't remember his name, but the ruler of Orcha and Datia, who was one of Jahangir's confidants, and I think he's the one who's about actually killing Abul Fazl. But his palaces.
Mambir Singh Deo.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. His palaces in Orcha and Datia are, they very clearly reference in some of their architecture and decoration, they reference Jahangir's royal architectural patronage. Sorry, that was a very long-winded and probably winding way to just say yes, that does happen.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am. In the interest of time, dear audience, we would only be taking the last two questions because I think we've troubled ma'am enough. So, Anaditya, if you could please ask your question, and then we will be taking Itika's question.
Firstly, thank you for the insightful lecture, ma'am. You mentioned the point of personalized tombs. Then, raising the example of Shah Jahan, who was buried in the Taj Mahal, commissioned for his wife Mumtaz Mahal, and not a personalized tomb, was there any negative reaction to this from the nobles or public at the time, especially considering that his son Aurangzeb and he did not have cordial relations? Could it be seen as disrespectful to him to not build him a personalized tomb?
It's a wonderful question. And I think that we have to, the kind of gut reaction would be, yes, it was disrespectful, because it was so out of line and very clearly out of, it would not have been what Shah Jahan, had intended. I think that had he not been, what's the word? Had he not been deposed, I think that he probably would have been the first to start planning his own tomb. I think that would have been something that he would have very much been actively engaged in. But when he was deposed, that obviously wasn't possible anymore. And in terms of when he died and ultimately getting buried in the Taj Mahal, I think that I think it's fair to say it was disrespectful, because it happened, he died, and then it's either that night or the next night, like his body is taken by river and buried without ceremony at the Taj Mahal. He doesn't get that kind of, grand goodbye. There's no pomp and ceremony associated with his, with his burial. And we have to take into account for something like that. We have to take into account the prevailing, well, it's really the prevailing political, winds, in that Alamgir came to the throne in a very bloody manner. He imprisoned his father, he kills his brothers, and then takes control. And the thing is that this is absolute power, right? It's absolute power in one person, in one entity. And after Alamgir's death, that absolute power disappears, like, from the Mughal ruler. But he had it, and his reign is, again, his is stupidly long. It's 1658 to 1707. What is that again? That's like 49 years, I think. So who is going to say anything, right? Who is going to say, this is disrespectful, your father should have had more? No one is going to challenge on that, because they can't, right? Everything has to be as Alamgir wants it, and that is what he wanted. So yeah, I don't really have any kind of concrete proof to answer that question, but those would be my thoughts on it. Yeah,
thank you, ma'am. And we would be taking the final question by Itika, and she says that can we say that the European writers have somehow prejudiced our views? And she says, how can we separate biased views of European writers or any other historian from the true accounts?
Yes, wonderful question. Yes, European writers have definitely created biased views. That is for sure. And a prime example of this, and something very dear to my work and my research. So my PhD was on Jahangir's mausoleum, and I'm hoping to finally be able to, kind of write it up as a book soon. But the writing out of history of Nur Jahan, in Shah Jahan taking credit for the construction of Jahangir's tomb, he writes about, or he has his court historians write about her in derogatory ways within the court histories. But you then have this same derogatory view of Nur Jahan being presented in the European sources. And she's presented, and it's a characterization which has persisted, up until very, very recently. It's being challenged now. But, she's presented as a power-hungry, female using her wiles to control her husband and keeping him drugged, and all of this kind of thing. And it's it's a very particular view which is presented, and it starts with the writings. I think it starts with the writings of Sir Thomas Roe, who is the first official European ambassador to the Mughal court. And, he comes and he's there ostensibly as the ambassador for James I, but he's really there on behalf of the East India Company, and he's trying to get the official farman to trade. And he realizes when he gets there that, there's so many different things he has to navigate. And his passages relating to Nur Jahan are quite, that they're not complimentary. They're about her getting in the way and being crafty and having to be, she has to be placated and all this stuff. And it begins this perpetuation of this idea that she's manipulative, she's power hungry, she's basically taken over the throne. And it's, there's it's not true to say those things because, at the end of the day, anything she's doing with the permission of Jahangir. So yes, she had a lot of power, but why does that automatically mean she's stolen it? This, sorry, it's a very, very big example, so I'm not going to go into that any further, but it exemplifies the fact that yes, you do have bias in European sources. And in terms of how to address that, it's something which is beginning to be addressed. So I am sure many of you have seen or heard or read the new Ruby Lal's new biography of Nur Jahan, specifically presenting her as a co-ruler, right, as an empress. Not as somebody who stole power, but as somebody who had power and wielded power, but not in a way that was, it wasn't taken, it wasn't stolen. And, oh no, I've lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, sorry. So this, there's challenges to, that type of narrative. And in terms of biases beyond Nur Jahan, sorry, she's one of my favorite characters. The whole new, I mean, it's not new, but the push now to decolonize the curriculums, to decolonize ways of thinking and ways of teaching. For me, this is the important part of it, compared to what we study and how we approach these things. It's about recognizing that, yes, there is going to be bias in sources and, identifying them and challenging them and trying to find, just navigating to see where the truth lies in all of this. But it first begins with questioning. And so anything and everything you read needs to be questioned, not just the European sources, but the Mughal sources as well, and the Rajput sources. And, because I know it's cliche, but, at the end of the day, it is true that history is written by the winners. And everybody is biased, whether they win or lose.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think that's a good note that we can end on, that history can never be devoid of bias. Just a thought, an afterthought from Professor Manpreet Kaur, ma'am. She's also a professor at our sister body, DAV Sector 10, and ma'am wants to know that if you have worked on the architecture of the Mughal harem as well.
Thank you. I am beginning to. So I actually am planning on starting a new project, which does look at the architecture of the Mughal harem and the space of the harem. I feel like you've read my mind, because I just submitted. So there's going to be a conference on the Mughals in Istanbul in September, which I've been invited to speak at. And the topic I presented was specifically on this, because it's not something which has been done yet. And I think it's a really interesting and fascinating thing to do, to examine, yes, looking at the harem the descriptions we have of it, the actual building still standing, but then also looking at the painted representations to see how it all fits together and to give us a better understanding of the space and how it was made and how it was utilized.
Thank you, Dr. Razvi. And I apologize to everyone. I know you have a lot of questions, but we would have to, in the interest of time, we would be forwarding you Dr. Chidar Razvi's email address, and you can ask your questions to ma'am via email. But we would be wrapping up the question answer session now. Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all our questions in so patiently and in such detail. I'm sure students are all pumped up to read Mughal history again.
Yeah.
And now I invite Dr. Mini Girewal, ma'am, who's a senior faculty member in our department, to give the formal vote of thanks. Mini, ma'am.
Thank you, Chandni. On behalf of the principal, staff, and students of Meherchand Mahajan DAV College, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Mehreen Chida Razvi for her excellent presentation on the topic, Memory and Symbolism in Mughal Tombs. Dr. Razvi, it was indeed a pleasure to have you with us and to have shared your insightful observations on this very interesting and profound topic. Your interweaving of the pictorial frames with anecdotes transported us to the grandeur of the Mughal times and helped create a vision of their glorious past. It was interesting to see how these tombs were built by the rulers as symbols of imperial power, dynastic memory, and lineage, thereby dwarfing those built by the Delhi sultans before them and also those made by Sher Shah. It was also very interesting to see how these gardens laid out in the tombs were symbolic of the gardens of paradise. The interactive session also, I'm sure, helped the students to clear many concepts, and I'm sure it would have inspired many of them to pursue their subject with more zeal and interest. We are very grateful to you for having spared your valuable time, and we look forward to more such enriching and learning interactions with you in the future too. Thank you very much, Dr. Razvi. I would also like to extend my thanks and gratitude to our principal ma'am, Dr. Nisha Bhargav, without whose vision and support this event would not have been possible. The Department of History is thankful to you, ma'am, for guiding us at every juncture. I would also like to thank our guests, the faculty members who have joined from the other institutions, our very own faculty members. A special thanks to Mr. Ashish Modgil for all his support. And last but not the least, I want to thank our dear students whose presence and enthusiasm have made this event a huge success. Thank you all. Over to you, Chandni.
Thank you, Mini, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. And that brings us to the end of our session. And even though Mini ma'am has thanked everybody, I think on behalf of Tarikh, I would like to thank our faculty, our head of department, Mrs. Poonam Devesha ma'am, Dr. Mini Garewal ma'am, Baljit ma'am, Ekta ma'am, Neha ma'am, and Indu ma'am for their guidance on every step of the way. And thanks to you, Dr. Chidar Razvi, for accepting our invitation. And we are eagerly looking forward to your book in September. Hopefully we'll get to interact again that time. And thank you to your audience, last but not the least, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.
If I can also just say thank you so much again for the invitation, to everyone for being here, for all your kind words, and I was delighted, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. A big thanks from heart, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.